Hello everyone, and welcome back
to Jurassic Park.
Today we're looking at one of my favorite decks to play since about a year ago when I built it for premium. It's just so much fun, and every new release it just constantly gets more and more support, which makes it even better. Specifically, we're going to be looking at a Gaia variant of Tachikaze. If you want Angerblader decks, just take your Angerblader standard deck and then slap the G-Zone on it that you find in this video, and then you'll be good. But otherwise, we're going to stick with Gaia. As such, we have ourselves a playset of the boy. This is really just kind of my preferred going first play. We have a lot of ways to spread gauge around our board, and so if we're going first, just giving everything a 5k buff is really nice to just kind of like everything can hit at that point. We don't really have to worry about having small numbers. Then we have other cards that can get even bigger. So it just helps our multi-attacking plays going first because we can actually do some multi-attacking plays going first now in this deck. So it's really fun. And if sometimes you just find you can't stride or whatever for some reason, having the 10k, you can just go for it right then and there too. That's kind of cool too. So far, really liking Gaia. This can honestly be anything, but that being said, I'm liking this so far. For our backup grade 3, I'm playing 3 copies of Optical Certo. I think that's what his name is. Yeah, Optical Cerato. You can swap the numbers of this and Gaia if you really want to. His main thing is that if you have to ride him, it's pretty good because you get an Excel circle, you get a gauge on something, and that's pretty important. His skills also work on rear guard, which is also very nice. That way, if it's like he's not just a dead card in our hand, if we call him to the board or superior call him from deck, stuff like that. He's really nice. Like I said, you can swap the numbers, and there's other grade 3s you could run too if you really wanted to. I think this is probably the most streamlined way to do this, but I'll get into some other options you can run later. Into our grade 2s, we have 4 copies of Ravenous Dragon Mega Rex. This card is very, very important to this deck because he eats stuff, and a lot of our stuff triggers off of being eaten. He's also very important because he can be one of our biggest attackers, and he also draws us cards, which can be kind of to our detriment a little bit in this deck. But all in all, he's really good, and he's everything we want. He's a big hitter, and he retires stuff on our board that can let our other combos go off, and there's really not much more that we could ask for with him. Next, we have a new card with Regiment Dragon Regiodon. This is everything I wanted to see from this last set. The fact that it enables multi-attacks before we hit GB is really, really nice. And if we're on Gaia, it really doesn't matter what ends up in his gauge or what we call out because we'll be giving it a static buff anyways. All in all, this just does everything we want. It gives gauge, it enables multi-attacks. It's also really nice because it can be retired by anything. Before in this deck, a lot of things needed to be retired by your Vanguard specifically, with the Engorge ability specifically. So to have more things that just pop off just by being eaten by anything helps this deck out a lot and allows it to do plays that would have been a lot trickier otherwise. Next, I'm running 3 copies of, I don't even know what this dude's name is, Heavy Bullet Dragon Diablo Cannon. I just always thought of him as like the baby Gaia. His main skill is that when he's retired by your Vanguard with the Engorge ability, while he is engorged, you can discard a card from your hand to call him back from drop zone. And then if you have a Vanguard with Gaia in its card name, he gets plus 5k. Really helpful for those multi-attack plays. This deck basically just focuses on Neburos and consuming your entire board and then rebuilding it right away and then swinging with a full board like 3 or 4 times over and over. Having Engorge is also really helpful because he can allow things like Regiodon, whatever, to go off just like the Mega Rex, and that can happen even going first because if he's on your Vanguard or Rearguard, he still has the Engorge skill. That's not GB locked, so you can still sack things to go into aggressive plays early. Into our grade 1s, we have 3 copies of Lacerate Rex. When placed from hand, he gets a gauge, and whenever he's retired, you can Soul Blast 1 to add one of his gauge to your hand. Mainly running him for those pluses because we can superior call him from hand sometimes in the middle of our battle phase, and getting that extra card to hand helps when we're sacking our board and certain pieces can't always come back. It's also helpful because he gets himself a gauge, which can help during those Gaia turns where the gauge is actually relevant to give him a power boost. But other than that, just a solid card, just does everything we want to. It draws us cards and it gets Gauge, and it has a 10k shield on top of that, which is also pretty nice. Next, another new card we are running is Blue Sprint. This is just a copy of the grade 2 Regiodon. It does the exact same thing, which means we get to run 8 copies of it, which is also really nice, especially since the skill to call his Gauge out when he's retired is a hard once per turn to their card name. So you can only activate one of these per turn, but that really doesn't matter. It's so good for just pushing our opponent really hard and early, because we can start doing this as early as turn 1 going first. Next up, we have Spread Amarga. This is just another really handy card that triggers off of being retired by anything. I was running him at max copies in an older version of this build, but with the new stuff coming in, it's kind of nice to have the new very aggressive early options. Since he's GB, when he's retired, you can draw a card and then call a card from your hand. So that's how you can kind of like trigger a Lacerate Rex in the middle of your battle phase to just kind of get more cards out, get a Gauge, and then probably sack him and then draw that card. So it ends up being like a +1 in the end. So it's really nice. And just having things that trigger off of being retired by anything are really, really important in this deck. Lastly, in our grade 1s, I'm running 2 copies of Raven Terra. I would like to get this up to more. It's just really difficult to find the room because he costs soul. He's also GB, so when he's retired by your Vanguard with Engorge, which is important, you can Soul Blast 1 and call him back, and if you have 1 or less face-up cards and damage, you can countercharge. So this is our main countercharger. It's becoming more and more relevant with this build where it's at, but most of our stuff is free or costs soul. So the fact that he costs soul kind of digs into our Lacerate Rex cards, but he can also enable multi-attack. So it's just, it's kind of a matter of which you value more, and honestly, the 10k shield on Lacerate Rex kind of bumps him up in my mind. You could also just probably cut these and run another Spread Amarga, another Lacerate Rex. That's what I was doing, but I realized I really missed having that counter charge, and that's what I'm mainly running him for. But getting an extra attack during your Neburos turns is pretty handy. And he also has Engorge, which could become relevant in certain scenarios, I suppose. Going into our triggers, we are running Crit Sentinels, Stride Crits, Fronts, and Heals. I'm running Crit Sentinels instead of the Draw Sentinels because deck out is very real with this deck. We go through a lot of drawing. We go through a lot of Gauge. The amount of times where I've gone to a second Neburos turn, which sometimes that is necessary, I don't have enough cards in deck to make it through his second drive check. So the draws kind of hurt. If I could, I would like to try and find a way to run grade 1 perfect guards in this deck somewhere, but all of our grade 1s just do so much that we want to keep. So I'm not sure how I would figure that out. I would also like to do that so that I could fit more fronts in here, because man, checking a front on your Neburos turns after you've just eaten your board and rebuilt it is so good, just to make sure that everything can still hit. You still have some beefy hitters in the forms of like Mega Rex, but he's kind of like our only one right now. So to just make sure that things can still hit is really, really nice. But other than that, this is just like the super streamlined version. Stride crits, just because we're only running 7 grade 3s and we really want to be able to stride into Neburos, and a lot of times we don't want to discard any of our other grade 1s or 2s because they're so valuable on the board. So pretty self-explanatory there. If I could, I would maybe try and find a way. Maybe I could like drop the Raven Terras for 2 grade 1 PGs and then 2 more fronts. That might be something I'll do some testing with, but right now this is still working pretty solid. It's just super straightforward, streamlined list here. Lastly, for our starter, we're running a full play set of Little Tyranno because this card is so good. Whenever he's retired by your Vanguard with Engorge, counterblast 1, put him into the soul, check top 4 cards of your deck, and call 2 as long as one of them isn't another Little Tyranno. This is one of the main ways we're able to consistently rebuild our board over and over, because between his own skill of calling to the board, you might end up with one Engage and like the Regiodon or the Blue Sprint, and then you can call out another one, or you can use Spread Amarga to, if you have one in hand, draw a card, call one down, and then it can quickly spiral out of control. And this is another reason why we deck out so much. much is because we're calling 2 cards from our deck with him. So that's another reason to not run the draws right now. If you wanted to, you could probably drop 1 and run like a dragon egg or something there if you're worried about him getting sniped. But I also really like having him to call himself out, because then things like blue sprint, if you're going first, you can attack and then give the gauge to him. Or if you just go for a very slow first few turns where you just don't have much to call to board, or you don't want to call it to board because you're afraid it'll get retired, it's nice if you have to ride Optical Serato to put the gauge onto him, or because you're worried about something getting retired in the front row or an important piece like that. It's another thing where it does everything you want to do. Every single card in this deck does everything you want it to do. Looking at our strides now, we're running a full play set of Gluttony Neburos. This is honestly probably the only stride you will ever go into, just because you can completely just steamroll your opponent with this on a first stride, because unless they're hitting like crazy damage triggers, it can be really hard to deal with the full board rebuild that you do like 2 times in a turn. And the 6 drive checks on top of it, you're also retiring 2 of their rear guards. He also has a really nice skill when he's face up in G zone to Soul Blast 1 and give a rear guard a gauge. But not only that, it also becomes Engorge 2, which is handy for something like Diablo Cannon, I think its name was, Baby Gaia. So that way you don't have to actually retire something to get him engorged. All in all, another card that just does everything you want it to do. It retires your board, triggers your skills that trigger off of being retired by something with engorged, and he restands, doesn't lose drive checks, retires your opponent's units. It's so much value just in 1 card. Next up, I'm running 2 copies of Gyeongchi Raptor, the Premium Collection 2020 stride. This doesn't come up often, but it can, because once you've gone into something like Neburos and you have them face up, you can use his skill to give a couple of things a gauge. You have so many other cards in the deck between Regiodon and Blue Sprint and Optical Serato that you can pretty much get all the gauge where you need it. If you want to, you could probably find space for some copies of Rorbario in this deck, but that would make this deck even more soul heavy, but that would essentially turn anything with 3 gauge into a Sweeper Acrocanto. You could even probably make room for Sweeper in this deck too. He just doesn't really do what we want to. Like, we're trying to spread the gauge around and not stack it so much. We can sometimes do those stacking plays, so if you find that valuable, you could probably make room for him, but it's going to come at the cost of either your Diablo Cannon, which is important for the Engorge skill, and the multi-attacking. It's basically which do you value more, multi-attacking or huge power lines. So next we've got 2 copies of Gaia Dynast. You never want to have to go into this card if you can at all help it, but if it comes down to it, it's nice to have, I suppose. Basically just gets us a free multi-attack, because we can use his Engorge to sack something that will set off a multi-attack for a counterblast, and then when we do that, we can flip up a copy of him and countercharge and retire more, which can also become relevant. So we can set off a lot of skills with him, but all in all, we want to mostly just go into Neburos if at all possible. Next, we have 2 copies of Gaia Devastate. This is another card that ideally you don't want to have to go into because it means you're not doing Neburos, but it can be handy to, again, set off some of your retire skills. You can also retire your opponent's units with this, and we can buff him up by 10k, get him extra drive and an extra crit. Very rarely does this look better to you than going into Neburos, though. I'm sure there's probably a situation, a very fringe situation you could find yourself in where it's like, this is the best play, potentially. But ideally, we never have to go into this. If we do, things are probably going not our way. But having the option is nice. Next, going into our G-Guards, we have 2 copies of Bullish Primer. GB1, you can flip up a G-Guardian and he gets plus 5k for each of your open circles. This is pretty much our biggest G-Guard we can get into because we can get multiple Excel circles and the whole board can basically be empty. So he can get very, very fat, and we like that. Then we have 2 copies of Blockade Ganga. His skill is that you can retire one of your rear guards and then choose 2 of your other rear guards, and until end of turn, if they were to be retired, you bounce them back to your hand. This is helpful for when we go first and we want to commit to a board. We can basically just drop this and then say, all right, if you want to swing at my rear guards, they're just going to come right back next turn anyway, sometimes getting us a whole new gauge and stuff like that. Very, very useful to just make sure that we don't run out of steam, especially when we try to go and commit to a board early. And lastly, we got 1 copy of Dimorphalanx. He's just your 20k G guard if you have less rear guards than your opponent. Sometimes you just need to get GB, and that's basically what this is here for. Or you just need something to flip up for Bullish Primer. That's really all he's here for. Lastly, we have a copy of Dismal, just because we're a very rear guard reliant deck, and when we have gauge on something like Reggiodon, I've probably said both. I don't know how many times at this point. And we want that to stay there for our next turn to multi-attack with. It can be really useful to say, hey, you can't touch that. So pretty self-explanatory there. Some other options that I like but haven't been able to find room for yet are things like the OG Dark Rex, just for the opportunity that you could swing with a Vanguard 3 times in a single turn. That I was running it, it just rarely ever came up, and they would usually be dead with just Neburos anyways, so he's not currently in the deck, but if you want to try it out, I think that's a really fun play. You could also run a couple copies of Heavy Arzine. He was also in the deck, but he needs to be, he's basically a grade 3 version of Little Tyranno, except he can't call other grade 3s. And he also needs to be engorged for that skill to go off. You could probably cut like maybe a grade 1 or grade 2 to try and find space for this if you want to, but I've already got such an issue with deck out that I don't know that I would really value that too much. There's also Dino Chaos, if you really wanted to go that route, and then in which case you could probably swap out Gaia altogether, because then your whole strategy could focus on just going first and getting first stride. But I was running it, I just rarely ever saw it enough to really justify it. And lastly, you could also probably make room for Coella Magnum. That card's really good. Checking stands is really good, especially if you were to try and find room for like Sweeper or something. But his skill of on retire to, yeah, it doesn't even require engorge. Okay. But yeah, his skill of on retire, put him back to the deck, draw a card, and then give one of your other rear guards 5k. That's also really good. Well, that is the deck, everybody. I really hope you're able to give this deck a try. I find this deck so much fun, mainly just because I'm a very like combo aggro player, and this does both of those things very, very well. Just be careful you don't deck yourself out. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. If you would like to, definitely like and subscribe to support me and see what other decks I'm going to be doing later on. I have a very strong focus on the premium format mostly, and hey, I was able to finally stop playing the Digimon trading card game long enough to make this video. You can also check out my main channel if you want to. I'd really appreciate that too. But anyways, till next time.